Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, guys, last week we covered the stunning breaking news that UK Prime Minister Liz Truss was out after just 6 weeks in office. That makes her the shortest serving Prime Minister in all of UK history. It wasn't really even close. Why was she forced out? Well, simply put, she went whole hog on that market fundamentalism we were just talking about right out of the gates, and her much revered markets promptly revolted in catastrophic fashion. Truss, who was obsessed with Margaret Thatcher to such a degree she would intentionally, in very cringy fashion, imitate her dress in a cartoonish way, she also imitated Thatcher's economic policies in a sort of cartoonish way, slashing taxes on the rich, halting a planned corporate tax rise, even lifting a cap on banker bonuses. The results were immediate, and they were catastrophic. The pound crashed. The cost for the government to borrow spiked. This triggered follow-on effects, like for large pension funds. They started to face margin calls and were faced with the prospect of having to fire sale their assets. The Bank of England had to swoop in with what was essentially a bailout before the Truss government was forced to backtrack and scrapped the whole plan. Never has a reckoning on an economic program been so swift and so thorough. Whatever upsides this sort of supply-side ideology might have been able to accrue in the 70s and 80s, those have long since been claimed. Now, this agenda is nothing but a loser, driving wild inequality, financial rigging, and instant or medium-term calamity. But guess who has 100% not learned this lesson at all? That would be the Republican Party. In spite of making some noises about a new economic approach in the early days of the Trump years, they're still trying to cartoonishly resuscitate Reaganomics in the exact same manner as Truss was trying to bring back zombie Thatcherism, Reagan's counterpart, of course, across the pond. Courting disaster with a catastrophic plan that sounds a lot like the one Truss used to tank the British economy. Don't take my word for it. Listen to one of the biggest cheerleaders for zombie Reaganism around, the one and only Larry Kudlow.
The U.S. midterm elections cavalry arrived early in London. What do I mean by that? Well, the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss has laid out a terrific supply-side economic growth plan, which looks a lot like the basic thrust of Kevin McCarthy's Commitment to America plan. Let's start with Truss. She is slashing tax rates and deregulating energy. I just love it. That's the liberal business media. This is so wonderful. The liberal business media, you know what I'm talking about, is now trashing her plan. That tells me Truss has it exactly right. By the way, Liz Truss is basically operating a Reagan-Thatcher-Trump economic policy.
I love how much is revealed by Kudlow, who was one of Trump's top economic advisors, admitting that Trump's economic policy ended up just being the same old Reagan market fundamentalism that the GOP has fully embraced and the Dems have mostly embraced for more than 40 years. Let's do tax cuts for the rich, plus moral outrage, culture war, panic attacks. How original. But the part I really want to focus on today, because it has immediate potential consequences for us, is the fact that the GOP is actively threatening America with the same calamitous fate as Britain if they are able to win in the midterms. After all, they have, in fact, against all better judgment, released their plan for governance, and astonishingly, it might even be worse than what Truss had planned. Because unlike her, whose ideological fervor accidentally caused a crisis, the Republicans are actively, intentionally planning a crisis. That is literally what they're saying out loud. Just take a look here. Here's the headline from the Washington Post, quote, GOP to use debt limit to force spending cuts, Kevin McCarthy says. McCarthy, of course, would be the speaker if GOP takes control. So you get that? They want to use the debt ceiling in order to tank the entire economy hostage and threaten it if they don't get their way on their own Liz Truss-style agenda. An engineered fiscal crisis at a time of such economic precarity with a full recession nearly certain is exactly the type of own goal that could spell complete disaster. After all, the escalating crisis of the Truss budget was caused by a massive increase in the cost for the government to borrow. That spike in government borrowing costs caused pension funds to collapse. That pension fund collapse nearly triggered a wholesale British economic death spiral. The lesson here is that markets are very complex. They are very interconnected in ways that literally no one actually has a complete picture of. What would be the cascading effects of a debt ceiling showdown or an actual debt ceiling default? No one knows, and I don't know about you, but I would really rather not find out. But that's not all, because what the GOP wants is to use that debt ceiling crisis to extract more tax cuts for the rich and for corporations. Once again, sounds just like their apparent queen here, Liz Truss. For all their crying about deficits and inflation, when it comes to busting the budget on behalf of the rich, Republicans here really are all in. They want to permanently lock in the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations. They even want to add back in some more loopholes for corporations to exploit so they can pay even less in taxes. According to Trump advisor and radical market fundamentalist Stephen Moore, quote, "This will be a central driving theme of the Republican Congress making those tax cuts permanent." Just the corporate tax cuts alone that the Republicans are pushing would cost more than Biden's student loan debt relief that they all had a panic attack over how all that spending would blow up the deficit and fuel inflation. And remember, the largest driver of inflation is actually corporate profiteering. 52% of inflation during the pandemic was because of corporate price gouging. So they're not only spending a bunch on rich people, but they're rewarding the very villains who are responsible for spiking your prices. Not only are they committed to making life easier for the rich, they're committed to making life harder for you. McCarthy has kept cuts to Social Security and Medicare on the table. Other Republicans, including Senator Ron Johnson, Senator Rick Scott, have already floated cuts to the program or even sunsetting them altogether. Not that any of that should be surprising, since Republicans have been looking for ways to undermine or cut these programs basically since their inception. The debt ceiling crisis, massive spending on the rich, cuts to Social Security and Medicare, rewarding the price gougers. This is all pure economic insanity. Truss calamity economics on steroids. And although they don't talk about it much and Democrats foolishly have said basically nothing about it, this is exactly the agenda that is on tap if the GOP wins control of the House and the Senate, which at this point seems quite likely. Just as Brexit foreshadowed Trump, Truss's economic disaster could foreshadow our own, an engineered crisis of epic proportions, but this time with politicians so foolish and so lacking in any accountability that they are unlikely to reverse course even if catastrophe does in fact ensue. Good luck, America. And, this is kind of playing in the background because cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.